Welcome everybody, good evening and welcome to this online residents forum, which we're calling the case for de-amalgamation of Inner West Council. My name is James Wyner and I'll be the chair and MC tonight, and I'm speaking to you from the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. This land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So this is a grassroots residents forum where we're seeking to both present and hear from you, the residents and voters of the Inner West, with regard to the amalgamated Inner West Council that we've been enduring these past 4 or 5 years. I myself, I'm a long-term Marrickville resident. Personally, I found the whole amalgamated council movement to be highly undemocratic. And the operations of the mega council I find to be just completely baffling. So we're coming together here tonight as residents to hear what you all have to say on the matter. So a few brief formalities. We have 5 key speakers tonight, and I'll be inviting each of them to speak for a maximum of 10 minutes each. Following that, we'll have a question and comments session, which will last for around 60 minutes. I'll give you some details about that when we get to it. I also note we have a couple of notable people in the audience. Councillors Rochelle Porteous from the Greens, Independent Councillor Pauline Lockie. I think we just saw Councillor Vic Macri. So we definitely want to hear from those councillors, and I'll offer you some time in the questions and comments period. So look, I'll just say a few brief words to set the scene, since things seem to be moving quite quickly with regard to this issue. I believe a vote was taken by council at a meeting back in May that residents be polled on the subject of de-amalgamation, and that poll to be held in conjunction with the September 4th council elections. Now, despite an attempt driven largely by the ALP to defer the timing of the poll on a technicality, the council's commitment to a poll was confirmed again at a meeting on June 8th. Now, since then, we've seen a lot of stuff going on. There's been confusion over the election itself due to the COVID situation. We've seen the state government divided on the issue of de-amalgamation, with the far right, led in particular by John Barilaro, speaking out strongly in favour of de-amalgamating some of the regional mega councils. We've seen Mayor Darcy Byrne launch his re-election campaign and tying himself in knots over the question of de-amalgamation and some other unsavoury matters. And we've had the Inner West Council commission a cost-benefit study and a telephone survey of residents conducted by outside firms. We've read of a straw poll of council employees as to their attitude towards de-amalgamation. So plenty going on. So I'll just lay it out before our first speaker by saying that the council election is set down for December 4th, and voters will get to answer this following question. Do you support the Inner West local government area being de-amalgamated so as to restore the formal local government areas of Ashfield, Leichhardt and Marrickville, yes or no? That's the question that will be put to us on December the 4th. So with that kind of summary of recent events, I think I'm going to throw to our first speaker now. I'd like to introduce Brian Halstead. Brian is the president of the Save Our Councils Coalition. He's a former chair of the Metropolitan Council Audit Committee. He's currently working with New South Wales De-Merger Alliance, which is an alliance of merged councils. And Brian has been working on this beat since forced amalgamations were first proposed. And he makes the case from a financial perspective that forced amalgamations were completely unnecessary and that mega councils are bleeding red ink. Brian, thanks for joining us, and I'll throw over to you now.
Thanks very much, James. For over 7 years, Save Our Councils has been fighting against amalgamations with some success stopping them, but sadly not in the Inner West. We've been studying the results of the amalgamation, and in March 19 published a report called A Sea of Red Ink, which pointed out the failure to deliver the financial promises as well as other benefits. It's available on the internet by just Googling Sea of Red Ink. In the Inner West, the government amalgamation proposal said the council in 1819 will be making a surplus of 22 million, but the merged council's plan showed a loss of 3 million. Red ink. The three standalone councils in 1415, the last year before merger, made a small surplus. Analysis we did across the state of the 20 mergers, and the key points were that the amalgamation proposals appeared misleading and deceptive, and the results were not achieved. The community should be given the right to a binding poll on demerging. At the state election, the SOC policy of giving the community that say in a poll was supported by all parties: shooters, farmers, fishers, Greens, Labours, Christian Democrats, One Nation, Animal, only opposed by the Liberals and the Nationals. In June 19, I made submissions to the Inner West operational plan and then circulated to the councillors, pointing out how the deficit of 18 million compared to the three former councils with a small surplus and the amalgamation proposal with a surplus of about 30 million. There were no reasons given for this variation from the amalgamation proposal, and the analysis of employee costs showed them rising by 13.8% in 8.3 years, above the previous year. And more importantly, in a demerger discussion, 25% above the previous councils, 5% per annum, which is well above cost increases. The plan was, in my view, unsustainable, and there was likely to be a cash crunch. I note that since then there was a sale of assets which has generated a good cash windfall. And I've not studied the latest operational plan, 21-22 plan, but note a deficit of 4 million, and that it's benefiting from a reduction in net wages of 7. As usual, the budgets by area do not show any actual or prior year figures, so the communities are in the dark and not being told whether cuts are going to be made. 5 years on, it's now 5 years since the amalgamations, and we had a opinion piece in the Sydney Morning Herald where we detailed the anger across the state about amalgamations. There were poor results, rate increases flowing from rate harmonisation, special rate variations being sought to address deficits, and communities feeling the loss of representation and control. There were 2 mergers before the Boundaries Commission and at least 5 or 6 others starting petitions to be merged. The only real answer to this is to give communities a say by poll and a government commitment to follow the wishes of the community. The communities want local back in the local government, with control back of the level of service, the level of rates to cover these services, and planning controls in their areas. There's no need for the council to have all their own back offices, computer systems, or service personnel. If there are systems and operations in the amalgamated council that work well, these can be shared. I can strongly recommend people look at the work done by Professor Joseph Drew on the impact of mergers. Much is included in his submission made to the Gundagai and Cootamundra Boundaries Commission report, and his talk on the Central Coast Friends of Democracy website is well worth a listen about the problems and the fact that amalgamated councils don't work. The legislative change proposed by the Shooters, Farmers and Fishers for demerger polls passed in the upper house with all parties except the Liberals and Nationals supporting it, and they defeated it in the lower house. A community group called New South Wales Demerger Alliance has been formed and led by Grantley Ingham from Save Bombala, and it's made up of community members at the moment of 9 councils: Gundagai, Bombala, Guyra, Inner West, Canterbury, Bankstown, Central Coast, Pittwater, Mid Coast and Tumbarumba. But they're seeking to expand to all merged councils, and we at SOC will be supporting them if we can. This group has the following objectives: to ensure local councils are restored by the demerger of amalgamated councils across the state, To ensure where a demerger is proposed, the process lets local communities decide with a valid poll of electors. To promote the use of shared system operations and assets between the demerged councils. To call on the New South Wales State Government to stand by the new legislation on demergers and pay the costs of de-amalgamation with a council or community. At the moment, some legislation has gone through that said if a council proposal for demerger is approved, then the government will pay for the cost of de-amalgamations. And then we in the NDA wish to promote legislation again, as previously proposed, to give the binding polls for current demerger and any potential mergers in the fishing. I think it's important for the Inner West community to recognise you're not on your own in this fight. It's going to be a battle though. It's the Boundaries Commission recommended demerger to the Minister and the Minister rejected without properly explaining the reasons. Massive support in Tumbarumba and Tumut for the demerger, with two nationals, Balalaro and Cook, also supporting the demerger, but it seems to have no impact. And this is why we've got to join together to ensure the changes that I mentioned above. I'd just quickly like to make a mention of the Morrison Lowe report on de-amalgamation tabled, I think, at your council meeting last night. And I'm sure others will talk about it this evening. I've not studied it in detail, but I'm concerned about the assumptions underpinning the calculation of costs. These assumptions need to be made available first so they can be understood and then challenged. I was surprised by the statement of a reduction of employee numbers of 115. It doesn't tie up with the cost figures above, but there may have been some reduction in the last 2 years. The demerger cost projected of 22 million is in stark contrast to Professor Dew's estimate of demerger costs of 4.5 million maximum for Gunda Magai Cootamundra. I'm also wary of community satisfaction surveys, but do not have access to former council surveys. A review of this Morrison Lowe report is absolutely critical. In conclusion, there's a way forward to get the local back in local governments, and the first steps is to inform the community and make the poll reflect the desire of the community to restore old councils. Then a council initiated proposal can be submitted and go to the Boundaries Commission. Save Our Councils and the new New South Wales Demerger Alliance are here to support the communities and the Inner West in getting this objective.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. That was great. Great to hear about the fights, the struggles going on in those other council areas. I think we should, anyone who's interested should check in what's going on with those struggles in those regional councils and see what we can learn from that. Okay, our next speaker is probably as well versed in the political history of the Inner West than anyone I can name. Hall Greenland is former Leichhardt Councillor, Walkley Award-winning journalist, political activist, and author of Red Hot, The Life and Times of Nick Oroglass, which in part chronicles the struggle to bring a greater level of democracy to local government via the open council concept. Hall, welcome, and perhaps you can reflect on where we are now compared to those heady days of the open council. Over to you.
Thank you, James, and thank everybody for organising this meeting. And of course, I want to acknowledge that we're all living and attending this meeting on the land of the Aurora Nation, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I mean, it is extraordinary good attendance tonight. I notice the numbers are now over 70, and there are 6 councillors. This is very hopeful and encouraging sign. I'd also like to remind people that in 2004, the old Leichhardt Council actually held a referendum in conjunction with the election of councillors on this very question of amalgamation, because the Frank Sarter and the City Council were pushing the agenda, as were people in Ashfield Council. And there was an overwhelming majority of 3-1 of residents against any move to amalgamate Leichhardt Council. So those signs from the past and from tonight seem to me to be encouraging. I was interested to hear about this Morrison Lowe report, which I too haven't had a chance to look at, and hopefully some of the councillors will throw some light on that later on. But it does remind me that down the years, and there have been similar reports touting the completely phony claims of economic and financial benefits from amalgamation. In fact, the last round of forced amalgamations was accompanied by a KPMG report, which again kind of had conclusions about the financial and other benefits of forced amalgamations. But the assumptions and the workings and the input for that report were never made public. And it seems we may be in the presence of, more dubious reports of that nature. The key point for me, and the key point I think for veterans of open council and smaller councils, has been that smaller units of government are absolutely essential for participatory democracy. The larger the units of government, the less clout individuals, neighbourhoods, groups and associations have. If you want an actually effective democracy as a person, as a citizen, you must, it seems to me, favour smaller units of government. Those units of government are the ones in which the citizen or groups of citizens can have the most impact. You know that yourself from your own personal experience. It's at the local level you can have some kind of impact. We tend to be drowned when it comes to the national or global level as far as having any real input or real say. So that seems to me to be the key thing, that if we want to revive and deepen democracy, smaller units, getting back to the local is absolutely essential. Hopefully what will flow from that will be much more responsive and with better services and so on. But the key thing is that the smaller units of government will give the citizen much more say, much more power, much more clout. It is true that local government, either of the merged kind or of the smaller kind that we're going to go back to, has been stripped of much of its power and influence over the years. The planning powers of councils have been whittled away and gutted. And so the local councils will be councils without a great deal of power. But that has always tended to be the case. The planning powers certainly for big infrastructure projects and for big overdevelopments, the ultimate say is always laid with state governments. And it's been local councils and their communities that had to mobilise in order to beat them back. In Leichhardt, as many of you will know, and I think it's probably true in Marrickville as well, the barbarians at the gate have always been state governments. The big threats to our environment, to our living amenity, have always come from state governments. So down the track, with our local democracy restored, we will have this continual battle in order to fight back against state governments, which are the kind of battering ram for overdevelopment and for the kind of things that threaten our living environment. James Wyner, who some of you will know of, who did pioneer local government, open council, and who fought off a couple of attempts to amalgamate or abolish Leichhardt Council in their 30 years on Leichhardt Council, always believed that the point about open council, the point about local democracy was that it gave real meaning, and it deepened democracy, that it gave the citizen a real chance to participate in a democratic community. And I think with this harking on about this question of deepening and reviving and regenerating a democracy that most people now realise has been undermined and gutted and hollowed out, is something I think we've got to continue to emphasise, that we are for a revolutionary and radical democracy based on citizens, based on their participation and based on their decisions being the ones that are crucial as far as our living amenity and the shape of our communities are concerned. I'll say one last thing is that back in the days when green bands and open council and so on were around, it is true that the sense of community was much stronger, it seems to me, than it is generally today. People tend to live online and in virtual communities. I mean, that's a cliche that all of you will be aware of. But tonight's turnout, and in a strange kind of way, the COVID lockdowns seem to me to return us to much more sense of community and community life. And in my other hat, I'm kind of involved in Friends of Cullen Park. And what we've noticed is the large numbers of people that are now taking advantage of that legendary and wonderful and iconic parkland, Cullen Park. And people are, and our meetings of Friends of Cullen Park are much, much larger than they have been in the past. So tonight's turnout, the turnout to Friends of Cullen Park meetings seem to me to probably indicate that we are going back to a more community-based life, certainly for a while, and that also seems to me to be encouraging as far as this struggle to restore local democracy is concerned. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hall. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. I like the use of barbarians at the gate there to refer to the state government. Nice bit of early 1990s culture reference there. Well done. Thank you. Our next speaker is Colin Hesse. Now, Colin, as many of you would know, is a current councillor representing the Greens in the Marrickville Midgebury Ward. He was first elected to council in 2004. Colin's worked in state parliament as an advisor to Greens MP Sylvia Hale. He's a member of the Australian Services Union, and he presents a wonderful local affairs program each Thursday morning on Radio Skid Row, which I recommend people check out. Colin, thanks for joining us, and tell us what it's like serving on a mega council. Over to you.
Thanks, James, for the introduction, and for the pronunciation, people out there, it's Hesse.
Sorry.
That's okay. Look, I'd also like to recognise I'm certainly here joining you from Gadigal land on Eora country, and I also wish to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Sadly, I'm not presenting my radio program live at the moment. I'm only doing music because of COVID. We're not allowed in the studios, but I hope to get back there, and obviously we'll be covering this issue in great detail when we can get back in the studios. I'd also like to recognise my fellow Greens councillors, my independent colleagues as well. It's great to be here with you virtually, and the many amongst you who I know, or some of whom I've actually talked to on my radio program as well. It's great to see some of you too. It's complicated times for us all. And thanks, James and Pip, for organising, and all those people who organised tonight's meeting. I really appreciate that. It is an important issue. So yes, I've had the experience of being a councillor. I did a first term on Marrickville Council 2004 to 2008, which I stopped for personal and sanity reasons, I think at the time, but mostly personal reasons. And I've had obviously the experience of doing the first term on the much enlarged Inner West Council. It has been a really stark contrast. I think whatever the faults of Marrickville Council, and every council has its faults, I think the strengths were very clearly that by and large, it felt like a fairly coherent geographic space. There was, I think, amongst all the councillors, a fairly high degree of understanding of each of the different suburbs that Marrickville Council covered. And therefore, the decisions we made around development issues and around the provision of services, recreation and so on, I think were very well informed. And necessarily, of course, whenever we were moving around in the community, we would have people remind us, even in the pre-Facebook days, of the issues that were important to them. I think it's really starkly different with this big council. Hall's already mentioned the wonders of Cullen Park. of which I have to say I know not a great deal, because I live in Marrickville and I've actually never lived north of Parramatta Road. I'm sure it's lovely, I've just never lived there. But we at the moment, of course, have an issue in Marrickville where the charge is led, and there are arguments around this, around the Marrickville golf course, where the charge on that issue of maintaining that as an exclusively golf course or significantly as a golf course at 18 holes is led by a councillor who resides in Balmain. And clearly, in my view, that charge is about the delivery of votes for him and the Labor Party at other levels of government. And I recognise too, there are friends of mine in the Labor Party here tonight, and I appreciate the Labor Party, like all parties, is hardly, there are many wonderful people in all the different parties. And so I'm not being sectarian, I'm just being real about that, the politics of it. And I think the way that manifests itself is in this big party, is in the big council, is it keeps us away from the community. And let's go to that, because in the New South Wales government's independent review panel report, an independent review panel set up by and hand-picked by Premier O'Farrell after the 2011 election, the report noted that larger councils would undermine the closeness of elected councillors to the community and allow councillors, and I'm paraphrasing here, to focus on strategic planning issues rather than the more local concerns. What that was code for was that they didn't like the connection between councillors and the community and the way that slowed down development, and particularly what developers wanted. And we see that delivered under this new system. As has, I think, been noted already, the planning powers were removed from councillors in 2017, just prior to when residents of the new Inner West Council went to vote. And I think a lot of people have been surprised, and I certainly see as a councillor a growing anger amongst our residents about what's happening. Because when there's a development application put in next to you, whether it be a renovation or a new building or a block of flats, no one who is elected has any say in it. So you have no relationship. It might be staff, and in fairness to the staff, I know they do the best job they can, but they're increasingly separated from the community and elected councillors. It might be a planning panel, the majority of whose members are appointed by the Minister for Planning. It might also be the Department of Planning itself if the development is expensive enough. Really, for those of you who might remember 10 years ago when Labor was hoiked, quite deservedly, around the Part 3A, the Liberals just rebadged it. And what bigger councils have done has removed as much as possible community from the equation. The other big example here, of course, was WestConnex. We had, and I recognise Councillor Lockie as one of those many resident activists who got involved in politics as a result of that. That in fact, when council was dismissed, the administrator, in fairness to him, appointed by the state government, actually allowed the funding and the operation and support by Inner West Council of community opposition to the WestConnex in a limited kind of way. When the elected council was sworn in, of course, that was removed as the Labor Liberal majority exercised its power. And I think it's an example of where, rather than the council supporting the community, the council actually undermined the community. Because, as I say, the community is distant, or the council is distant from the community. I know we'll get into this, but to amplify some of the stuff that Hall's already said, I hope to not repeat it, but I spoke on Radio Skid Row a couple of years ago with an academic from UNE, Professor Brian Dollery, he's a professor of accounting up at the University of New England. And he looked at the last round of forced reviews in 2001. They were forced by the Labor Party. And he found that there was no financial benefit. He's looking at this over 10 years. So no net financial benefit. I've spoken on the phone to Brian Dollery since, and to Professor Drew. I've interviewed Professor Drew on the phone as well on Skid Row. And neither of them expect there to be any difference. The Morrison Lowe report, as has already been alluded to, and I'm sure John will probably go into this, I think is based on a series of assumptions which might be, in Yes Minister terms, regarded as brave. And I think it's already been mentioned, I think quite rightly, the idea, the key amongst the underpinnings of their report were that 50% of the cost of de-amalgamation, and a very inflated cost in my view, I agree with earlier comments, would be covered by council. Whereas the legislation is very clear, that the Act is very clear. A de-amalgamation will be at the cost of the state government. I'd say additionally to that, the idea of shared services, and I thank Councillor Macri for asking this question at our council briefing the other night. Shared services, and there is no reason why you would not share services where it's financially beneficial to the community as a whole. The key issue here is democracy. That is the say our community has. Without that, we really have lost an enormous amount. Yeah, look, I think I'm probably more interested in, I'll wind up there because I think I think the questions we'll hear tonight will probably be very useful to just going where the discussion should go. Thanks.
Thank you, Colin. That was excellent. Thank you very much. And it's good to hear you lay out the lack of just how far removed we are as residents from the planning decisions that are made. That's very important. I think something we need to think about with regard to this de-amalgamation issue. So let's bring on our next speaker now. And many of you will know him, John Stamolis, Independent Councillor representing the Balmain Balladari Ward. John served the Balmain area in various capacities for over 20 years now. He was first elected to Leichhardt Council in 2008. So he's well placed to tell us what it's like being an independent voice under the new mega council model. John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, James, and good evening, everyone. I'd like to take you through a little bit of the history, if I could first, and then take you through some of the current scenario. Generational reform of local government occurred in 2016, but it was very poorly based. The minister simply asked us to put a ring around any two or more adjacent councils, and the minister would accept this. That's not robust. It's not analytical. It's very poor. We also know that most of the mergers, and there are only very few of them, most of the mergers were politically motivated, and they were not motivated by community interests. Near us, Inner West, 3 Labor mayors took a merger to the minister. Canterbury Bankstown, 2 Labor mayors took a merger to the minister, and Bayside similarly Labor dominated. Our merger was forced upon us by Labor and Liberal councillors, and the records are very clear in the meetings of Leichhardt Council and I assume other councils. Most importantly, however, what did the state government think of its signature merger policy? It abandoned the policy within 10 months. I think that says a lot. It's been a liability for this government. It's been trashed in every article, but we're stuck with it. Those few councils are now stuck with it, and we're going to now work our way out of it. The merger has not delivered efficiencies and savings. Our budget position continues to be in stress with deficits for years ahead. How are other merged councils resolving their problems? Canterbury Bankstown, recently a 36% rate increase. Georges River, 33% rate increase. Central Coast, 15% for starters, and wait until the final bill comes in for their ratepayers. If they're examples of savings, efficiencies and good outcomes for ratepayers, wow, that's a bad result. Inner West service delivery has not improved. We have lost staff, talent and experience, which we'll never replace. Our representation has fallen dramatically. The Inner West has 205,000 people. Most of you will know that the average for inner city councils, excluding the CBD, is 70,000. So we're 3 times bigger council than other inner city councils. In fact, 40% of our 25 councils in Sydney are under 100,000 people. So we're double what 40% of councils are. Representation is vastly different across councils. So this concept of local, we really don't understand. The size of wards in one council can be 5,000. The size of an award in another council can be 75,000. Ours is 41 at the moment. So it'd be nice to get some consistency around the numbers behind local representation. The Inner West Council culture at the moment needs great improvement. We've gone through a string of 5 GMs. We have a mayor who's facing suspension. We have numerous media articles which refer to the dysfunction in our council and its leadership. This is not good. And that's part of the reason why this merger isn't working. We have the highest level of complaints, code of conduct charges, threats of legal action, and that's just between councillors and the GM on each other. We recently did a satisfaction survey. We're finding out here only 58% of people say they
I think, is John frozen?
Yeah, he's frozen. He freezes sometimes on council meetings too, so it might be a problem with his link.
All right. We'll just give him a minute, see if he can refresh. If not,
satisfied or very satisfied with this.
It'll probably help if he turned his video off and reduced
yeah,
the...
okay. John, if you can hear me, your connection is pretty sketchy. You
I'm
want
just
to
going to message John and suggest what Margarita suggested.
Okay, we might move on to our next speaker then. We can come back to John when
Colin, I've just sent John a text.
that up.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Okay, let's
Can you
just,
hear me?
oh, there we go. He's back.
Can you hear me?
That's better.
So let's just cover the issue about the satisfaction. Our satisfaction survey says that 58% of people say they are satisfied or very satisfied with council. 1 in 5 people say they are not satisfied with council's integrity and decision making, and a further 43% have reservations with that. 1 in 4 people are not satisfied with their contact with council, which has been a big deterioration since the commencement of the merger. Less than 50% regard council as just or very just. Now read council's report and they read it very differently from a statistician, and I'm a statistician. They seem to spin those numbers around in a different way. In our staff surveys, 71% say they do not want to demerge. I wonder how many of these staff were with the old council so they could make an appropriate comparison. That, again, is very important. In terms of the council's engagement, we no longer have open committees. The 20 or so local democracy committees that we do have are not open to the community. They do not connect with council or the community and are completely controlled by council. Average attendances for these committees are around about 8 for a community of 200,000 people. That's not workable. We have virtually dumped hundreds of volunteers for many activities. Volunteering is extremely important to our community, and the Inner West has a very high proportion of people who want to engage. Our council has taken that away from them. And we know that 40% of people have concerns with community engagement. Words I often hear about our council are council control and council bureaucracy. That has to change. My statistical assessment and professional assessment of the Morrison Lowe report is that they've been very honest to us in that report. Here's what they've said. There's a lack of prescribed methodology. There are data limitations. There's a lack of data. There are time limitations. There's significant risks in estimating costs and benefits in the absence of a prescribed methodology. That's telling me, as an analyst and a statistician, that it barely has a heartbeat, this report. So anyone reading this report needs to read those messages and lines clearly. I believe they've been very honest about this report. They're making clear comments throughout this report. to alert the reader about data limitations, time limitations, and methodological issues. And I believe that any reader should take them into account. Very few consultants and analysts would put in those sorts of highlights and messages. So when you're reading it, you may wish to note that. The report really did address that state government will fund the merger. There are still years to go to complete our merger with high costs ahead for our merger. The promised savings and financial benefits from the merger have not been seen. That has not been addressed clearly, nor the chronic budget deficits ahead for our council. They didn't address why other merged councils are facing major rate increases. And in fact, if the Inner West Council even has a 15% rate increase, we'd have that to be $20 million on our community every year, every single year. They've not addressed why our council services haven't improved. So we're now into the 6th year since the merger, yet demerging is still a huge topic.
All right, John, looks like you've frozen again. Pity, I think you were just summing up nicely there. Colin, do you want to shoot him a message again?
I'll try that, or Jennifer might be beat me to the punch.
Okay.
She's got it.
Thank you, Jennifer. Let's give John a moment because he was just... I don't think we're going to get there, John. So I might move on, and if you want to make some final points, you can perhaps log back in and do that during our question and comments section. So I want to thank John anyway for that contribution. Now, let me see. Where are we doing? Okay, let's move on. Okay, our final speaker before we throw it open for some questions and comments is Pip Hinman. Pip is the host and the impetus behind tonight's Residents Forum. Pip is a journalist, political activist, and is a member of Socialist Alliance, currently standing for a seat on council in the Stanmore Damun Ward. Pip, thank you for bringing us together this evening, and I know you're deep into the case for de-amalgamation, so please speak to that.
Thanks, James, and thanks everyone for coming along. I want to first start by acknowledging the Gadigal Wangal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to them and their elders. This land was never ceded, and we, in saying all this, we're continuing to pledge our solidarity to their just struggle for justice. Look, I think there are three main arguments for de-amalgamation of the Inner West Council. One is democracy, two is putting local back into local government, and three is that we need a council that serves the community, not big business. So, I mean, you've already heard this from the speakers already, but forced amalgamation has dramatically reduced local representation across the three councils, Ashfield, Marrickville and Leichhardt. In numerical terms, councillors have been reduced from 36 to 15 in, of course, a much bigger council. The meetings, as others have addressed, have had impossibly long agendas, leaving councillors very little time to adequately consider the issues. I think my view is that councillors need to be connected to their communities, because unless they are, really, they're not adequately representing them. But now they're expected to be knowledgeable about a suburb, a development, a street corner crossing, the best cycleway route, all across at the other end of the LGA. And for councillors taking their job seriously, and I know a lot do, there's a lot of consultation involved with residents, action groups, etc., to be across the issue. But the current setup doesn't allow for this. It's also abandoned precinct committees, and it's opting instead for a hand-picked committees of quote unquote professionals. Of course, all this leaves residents out of the question, out of the equation, when in fact they're often the ones with the best knowledge, the best intelligence of the issues. Putting local back into local government is really very important. Forced amalgamation made the Inner West Council more remote from ordinary residents. It makes the council out to be more like an enterprise focused solely on the budget bottom line. And over this last 6 years, services have declined, as many people keep telling me and other councillors. Their concerns are being ignored. Bigger in this sense has not meant better. Even those who supported the forced mergers in 2016 have admitted that 19 of the 20 merged councils lost money since the merger and have chronically underperformed compared to the remaining 108 New South Wales councils that weren't forced to merge. Now, this is data from audits dating back to 2016, analysed by LSI Consulting, and that was in the Sydney Morning Herald last October. According to the LSI Consulting Group, the Inner West Council was the second worst financial performer after the Bayside Council, which incidentally was the forced amalgamation of Rockdale and Botany, where there is a campaign for de-amalgamation happening now too. So my third point is that, you know, all of us on this hookup, I imagine, and many, many more besides, but we want a council that actually works with us and for us. In many ways, you could say the New South Wales government's forced amalgamation was aimed at weakening local resistance, certainly to WestConnex, but other inappropriate developments as well around the rail corridor. The New South Wales government's agenda has always been about boosting profits of its big business mates. That's no secret. They say that publicly. And if public assets have to be sacrificed, so be it. Really, the Berejiklian government, the Baird government before her, and then the O'Farrell government before him, we're not super worried about council's profit and loss sheet, even if they went broke, because as far as they're concerned, they would just get council to sell off our assets or outsource them. But of course, we shouldn't forget that these are our assets. These are not their assets. And so essentially by doing this is theft. As has been noted, the New South Wales government promised millions to the forcibly amalgamated councils as a sop, but it didn't materialise. They knew it was very unpopular, so they put a stay on the rate rise. Now, of course, we're all getting our rate notices, and people are seeing what one of the elements of the merger policy is about. Right now, the main argument from Labor and Liberal councillors in the Inner West is that it will be very expensive to de-amalgamate. That is, in fact, their main argument. Well, we don't know how much it was to amalgamate, but the figure of 30 million has been bandied around, of which 10 million was actually given. If we assume the cost of de-amalgamating will be in the same order, it will still pale beside the democratic, social, environmental and financial cost of carrying on with this mess. The New South Wales government made this mess and it must be forced to pay to fix it. And there is provision for it to do this in the amended Local Government Act, as others have said, but it will not do it automatically. Of course, it's going to take community pressure to win this. And that is why a strong vote for de-amalgamation will exert a powerful political pressure on the New South Wales government to do the right thing, to respect the will of the people. If more councillors who are up to taking the fight up to the government are elected on December 4, then we will have a better chance of putting the pressure on to force the state government to reverse the forced amalgamations and to pay for the cost of doing so. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Pip. That was great. Thank you very much. Before we go to our questions and comments, let me just see. John, I see you're back. Do you want to, you seem to be about to sum up there. Is there any points you want to make just to finish off? We lost the last bit of you there.
You can hear me now, James?
Yep, all good.
Yeah. And look, just to summarise, just very quickly, as I said, we're into our 6th year since the merger, and yet this demerger is still a major topic and major issue within our community and council. And I think that says a lot about how our merger is performing at the moment, that this is a major issue. And also, if the small number of mergers that occurred in New South Wales were presumed to be a success, no other councils anywhere are following us. No one is looking towards us as a model of a great merger at all. And in fact, they're shying away from it. And finally, I'd like to thank Councillor Vic Macri, the Deputy Mayor, who seized on the opportunity to put this motion forward. I assisted Councillor Macri with this motion, so it's lovely that this was put forward by 2 independents. And I thank my fellow councillors in the Greens and Pauline Lockyer, fellow independent, who have been highly supportive of this as well. Thank you.
Thanks, John. That was great. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks to John and Pip and all our speakers. So we'll open up for some questions and answers and comments now. If you'd like to ask a question or make a contribution, if you can use your raise hand emoji or put your name in the chat. If you don't want to speak publicly, you can type your question in the chat and I'll attempt to get to it and read it out. We're going to allow 3 or 4 minutes for each contribution maximum, so please keep that in mind because we want to hear from as many of you as we can. And what we'll do is I'll probably take a clutch of 3 or 4 questions or comments and then go to our speakers to respond and then come back and take some more questions and so on. I mentioned earlier we have a couple of important names in attendance, Councillor Porteous, Councillor Lockie. We also have Jennifer Aaron from the No West Connects campaign. And I mentioned that I cited Councillor Vic Macri, and we also have Councillor Margarita de Cruz here. So we want to hear from all them as well. Maybe I open some of the first couple of slots to them. I can see Jennifer has a hand up, so I'm going to throw to her if you want to unmute Jennifer.
Thank you very much. I guess the first thing I would like to say is that the question that's been put to us on the 4th of December is the same question that was put to us over 6 years ago. And I attended 4 of those public meetings. And at all those public meetings, it was overwhelming that the community did not want to amalgamate. Overwhelming. And yet there was one person who was determined to have an amalgamated council and overrode all of the community, and that was the mayor. Pip made reference to the fact that the council had dissolved the precinct committees. Well, the council didn't dissolve the precinct committees. The precinct committees, I was a deputy chair of one of the precinct committees, and that was again solely by the mayor, who did not want the precinct committees, who thought they had too much power. And the precinct committees, as you know, were completely all volunteers and did a lot of the work of council for the community. The amalgamation was forced upon us, and it was forced upon us by the state government, but it was also forced upon us by the mayor, and who I think has to accept an enormous amount of responsibility for the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. The financial burden on our community has been absolutely and utterly devastating. I was involved in the health industry in 1978-79 when the government then amalgamated all the health regions, and we all know what happened with that. That was an absolute mitigating disaster. So that should have been an indication that this was never going to work. I think that one of the things that has disturbed me the most is the total lack of democracy within our council. And again, I have to say that that has predominantly come from one person as well. I think that people in our community are absolutely and utterly under an enormous amount of strain, and they're fatigued. They're fatigued about having to campaign against the West Connects. We're fatigued about what is happening with development in our area, with the overdevelopment and the bulk and the scale of some of the developments. But I think what is really distressing more than anything else is the fact that there does not appear to be any democracy whatsoever left in the Inner West Council, and that the community is not heard, and the community is really not even given a voice. Reference has been made to the loss of staff. We have lost an enormous amount of experienced staff from the Inner West Council, and I think that's very distressing in itself. People who've made an enormous contribution, and what we have now is we have a number of people working in council who don't have the experience of the staff that we've actually lost. And we talk about local councils selling off their assets, and the state government, the federal government saying we have to sell off our assets. The state and the federal government are selling off our assets on a daily basis without any consultation whatsoever to anyone in this state. And I'm in two minds about the demerger. I'm very conscious of the money, the ratepayer money that has been spent in the amalgamation. It is one of the things I would like to see is some real transparency in the community, be told categorically how much money this amalgamation has actually cost the ratepayers, because it's in the millions and millions and millions of dollars. And I would like to know how much it's going to cost us to demerger. But I support what's been said in the fact that our local councillors have to know what is happening in their community, and they have to be local. They have to be seen. We have to see them. We have to know what they're doing for us. We have to have access to them. And the total diminution of democracy at council meetings, where the community are not given the opportunity to be heard, is absolutely and utterly reprehensible. And so I would certainly like to see, starting right now, a return to the democracy that we've had prior to 2016. And I would like to see that the council, that the community is heard, and that whatever the community is putting forward that's in the interest of their community is given respect and is given a voice and is listened to and hopefully is followed through. But at the moment, I can't say I'm for or against. I'm extremely concerned about the amount of ratepayer money that has been spent on this amalgamation, which I really hold one person responsible for. And I think that before we're in a position to be making decisions, I think we need to have an understanding of exactly how much money has been spent and how much it's actually going to cost. I think that's vital for people to make a decision one way or the other.
Thank you, Jennifer. We have a hand up from Councillor Rochelle Porteous, so I'll throw to you now, Rochelle.
Thank you. This term of council has been the most heartbreaking term of council for me. I had the privilege of having 3 terms on Leichhardt Council, and to see how democracy does and should work, and to see how Leichhardt was not perfect, way from perfect. And we had some good councillors and we had some bad councillors. But we had a system which was based on an open and democratic process, where the word of the community and the word of the individual resident was really listened to and was respected, and where we genuinely, I'd say most councillors genuinely tried to make sure that decisions were being made which were inclusive of the residents and were taking into account the issues that were being raised by the residents. And I don't know how many times people would come to me afterwards and say, well, sometimes they got what they wanted, but when they didn't get what they wanted, they would still say to me, you know, I didn't get the outcome that I wanted, but I was listened to, I was acknowledged, I was respected, and I can therefore accept the decision that was made. And I think we need to think really deeply about what this means to us as members of a community, as human beings, because we are actually, it's not money, you know, this is way beyond money. This is actually about how we want to live in our society, how we want to be governed, and how we choose to be governed, and what value we give to democracy. And I think that is where we really need to place our emphasis. We've got a forcibly amalgamated council. If you like, it's a forced marriage we've had with 3 different councils. And we now want to get out of it, just like we want to get a divorce. We want to get out of there. We don't want it anymore. And we shouldn't need it anymore, because we know that this is actually eating at what the core of what is actually the good part of us living in a community, living in a society. So I hope I'm making sense here, because I do think it's so important that we see where those values are. When Jennifer talked about the loss of our resident precinct committees, again, it makes me weep to think of the enormous amount of goodwill, hard work, skills and experience and love for our communities that so many of the local residents put into those resident precinct meetings, and how effective they were in giving individual residents the right to turn up to the meetings every month and tell what was wrong when the local street, the garbage wasn't getting collected, that we needed a pedestrian crossing here, we needed to rethink that development down at the end of the street. But there was a real sense of being listened to, being heard, and of being a valued member of a community that your local council was going to acknowledge and was going to take action on. And I think a lot of the people who are on this meeting tonight will recognise that as being something absolutely critically important to what makes us want to get back to that kind of council again. And the real value that a council like Leichhardt had was that it was that kind of council. I mean, we would have an open council at the beginning of the meeting where anybody could come along. You didn't need to book in beforehand. You could speak on any item that was on the agenda. And we would make sure that then all those items were dealt with before any other items, so that your item would be dealt with while you were still in the room, and you could listen to the debate, and you could hold councillors accountable for what they were saying and for what they decided. And that's the way democracy should be. We know what the situation is now, where the fact and thank God we at least have the public forum, because believe me, there was a push to lose that as well. But we have a public forum, and then everybody goes home, and the debate happens without a public being there. That's not really democracy. And look, I could go on and on and on about what I've seen about the slippery slope that happens when you've got a large amalgamated council trying to deal with the business of 3 councils within a limited time during council meetings. And look, I totally understand that some of the councillors, particularly maybe some of the newer councillors, have been shocked at the amount of time that democracy takes in debating, and have tried to limit the agenda as much as possible. But to give an example, Leichhardt Council had a delegation to the mayor and the general manager, so only up to $150,000 could be spent without it having to come to council to be determined by the council. Now, with this amalgamated council, it's 1.5 million. You can imagine how many decisions are being made that as councillors we do not cite. And why is that? The entire argument as to why we don't get to cite, I mean, obviously I voted against that, but we don't get to see these, and we don't get to determine them, is because of the sheer quantity of items that we would deal with an amalgamated council, and that we wouldn't get through the business on the agenda if we actually dealt with all of those items under 1.5 million. But what kind of democracy is that? And I could give you many more examples as well, where previously there would be so much more scrutiny on policies, on plans of management, on consultations with local communities. And again, we've lost all of that. And over and over again, the reason for that is given that we don't have the time. It would take too long. The meeting would go too long. We are just you know, we have gone down a slippery slope of losing a lot of that accountability because the amalgamated council is way too big to be able to deal with the business on the papers. And harmonisation of services, I'll conclude with that. You know, we've got all of our services now being, in inverted commas, harmonised, which generally means a dumbing down of the quality of our services, a reduction. Certainly in Leichhardt, we've seen significant drops in cleaning, for example, in all of our basic services in parks and so on, because in other councils, I won't name them, they had a much poorer service. So we've had to donate our services to other parts of the local government in order to try and balance. But effectively, our area was performing at a much higher level and now performs at a much lower level because we're harmonising. And I know you're all getting your rate notices at the moment, so you can see how bad harmonising is. I mean, I argued, the Greens argued, that there should be no harmonisation of rates, that rates should stay the same. And I think you can see why we argued that, because as soon as you start this harmonisation process, they say there's winners and losers. Well, the way I see it, there's only losers. And, you know, we're losing and we're losing and then we're losing again when it comes to the forced amalgamation of our councils. But what we're losing most of all is the democracy, and we're losing our soul, and we're losing our sense of place, and we're losing our sense of belonging and ownership of our local area and our local decision-making processes. These are so important. I think they go way beyond anything financial. Thanks.
Thank you, Rochelle. Yes, very important. I think you point out some of those cultural issues around amalgamation and how they've been damaged by the sheer size of Inner West Council. Just a quick comment from the chat from Marie Sheehan. A friend who owns a 1-bedroom unit in Dulwich Hill has just received a rates notice that is equal to my rates notice for a house in Annandale, not looking equitable. I'll take one more speaker before we get some comment from our expert panel. I have a hand up from Sandra Huckabee. If you want to unmute and go for it, Sandra.
I'm unmuting. Is that? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Thank you very much. I am actually a member of the community. I haven't lived here for a particularly long period of time. I moved into the area in 2008, and I don't belong to any political party, and I don't like the idea that councils are dominated by parties, and therefore the decisions seem to be coming, you know, through party affiliation sometimes rather than actual interest for the local area. My experience was that I haven't found the council, even prior to amalgamation, particularly responsive to community needs. And I, in fact, after being here 6 or 7 years, wrote to the mayor and actually spoke to him and said, I am not a de facto council employee. I'm sick of cleaning the lane. And that fixed up for a little while, but then that deteriorated again. So my comment is, I don't see how the larger council is in any way responsive. And I went back and looked at all of the records about stormwater, for example, because that became pertinent to me. And it seemed to me that so many issues, and I know this probably to other people may be a small issue, but so many issues just got rolled over from council to council. And if it wasn't addressed, then it never became addressed. And then I went through and analysed, not like John Stamolis can, but I went through and analysed the allocations of budgets. And it seemed to me that there, in a lot of places, the ratio between what was spent on personnel and other resources just seemed way out of whack. So I've waited for months now for responses from council, but I don't think it works how it is. but I'm not terribly convinced that everything worked perfectly before as well. So I'm sorry to be, I think I'm going to be a discordant note, because I feel this is a very empathetic and very closely knit group, but I'm giving you my personal account of what has happened to me as a result of being in this council. It hasn't worked well, and I think the least we can do is go back to a smaller council, and hopefully it becomes more responsive to the needs of every community member, rather than groups that are, you know, have a particular barrow to push, or a particular association with any political party. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Sandra. That's fine. No need to apologise. We are empathetic, but we are also hard-assed. So,
look, it's the way it is, but I think we've become farther and farther removed from any decision-making process in this country. So that's why I would favour de-amalgamation, but also I would want councils to become a lot more aware of every member in the community as well.
thank you. Okay, there was a fair bit there. I'll throw back to one of our speakers, whoever wants to step up.
Happy to have a crack, James.
You're going to go for it, Colin?
Why not?
Yeah, I think Jennifer's, and there's been a few comments in the chat about selling off of assets, and so maybe you could at least see if you can address that. Go for it, Colin.
Yeah, look, I want to acknowledge Sandra's comments too. I don't think any of us here, and I think Rochelle acknowledged it in her comments too. There was no, I don't think anyone would pretend that the previous councils were perfect, but I do think, and I think Sandra's on the right beam there. I think I'm seeing agreement here that in fact what we want is a smaller council to be more responsive. And I think in Marrickville, certainly I can't speak to the other councils, but I think in Marrickville we were heading in that direction, where I particularly noticed over the last 10, 15 years that council was actually heading in that direction. And I think it's moved away. I don't think there's an intention by any individual staff member to move in the other direction, but it's been difficult. To that question of selling things off, clearly one of the understated or unstated aspects of O'Farrell's original independent review panel was barely unstated, really, because they talked about, in fact, contracting out of services and selling off. And if you look at some councils around New South Wales, Queanbeyan City Council, for instance, where my late father served a term as an independent back in the 1990s, since it was amalgamated, it's actually got rid of all its social services, a lot. So everything's run by outside of council. We have resisted that in the Inner West, but of course there has been a push by the Labor Liberal Party people to certainly move in that direction. As I think someone else has commented on the comments, who knows what will happen after the election. I think that's fair comment. I think though, to go back to an issue that I think it was Jennifer raised earlier, and I think that's the cost of amalgamation. The consultant's report took a guess because, and I know we Greens have asked continually, both at meetings formally, I know my colleague Margarita de Cruz has asked this a number of times formally, how much did the amalgamation cost? And the answer was that they don't know, because the decision was taken before the council had councillors not to count the cost. So the assumption is that it's cost, I think, something like $24 million, but they don't really know. But let's just say it was $24 million. That's $24 million worth of opportunity that was, and I think about $4 million that came from a grant from the state government. So the $20 million that's been spent has effectively been $20 million which has not been spent on services to our community. That's a huge wasted, lost opportunity. It's a staggering opportunity. The cost of the demerger, I will say this again, the Act makes it very, very clear, should the minister agree, and this is where we actually have strength, and it's why the consistent calls of the Greens through a number of notices of motion, along with Councillor Stamolis, and I'm very, very glad that on the last time round, I think it was the 5th time round, Councillor Macri joined us. But that's why we were pushing for a vote, because to go through the bureaucratic process, it's clear that the government who authorised the forced amalgamation will not support de-amalgamation. What we have in our favour is a process to a poll. If that poll votes for de-amalgamation, and I hope it does, but if that poll votes for de-amalgamation, the minister knows that the majority of residents of Inner West Council want to de-amalgamate. And it's a brave government and a brave minister indeed who refuses the will of the people that's taken through a legitimate and valid poll. That's what the country councils have not done. And that's why what we've done is very important. It's why the Labor and Liberal Party opposed it so vociferously on this council. They don't want a poll because they're frankly afraid of our community. They like the big council. You know, we Greens, and I'll give a plug here for us. Yes, we are a party. Just for a bit of historical interest, the Greens in Australia were formed in Leichhardt by Greenland and Tony Harris and others. I helped form the Greens in Marrickville more than 30 years ago. This is not a top-down process. We are from the community, and that's what we're here for. You know, I don't have a career in this. This is just what I do to help the community I've lived in for more than 3 decades. But that question of where the power is, it is with us, and that's why getting the argument out there is important. I think we've got to be very, very clear. And again, I'll state, not only do the costs have to be borne by the state government, but the kind of costs that are asserted by the Morrison Lowe report, which again, I think is unsupportable in so many ways, is a worst case scenario. I think what the ultimate answer, the ultimate result they gave was, well, all the councils, all of the de-amalgamated councils would be not flash financially, just like Inner West Council is not flash financially. They said we'd be worse off as smaller councils and bigger councils. I'm not sure I believe that, because it's basically licking your finger and putting out the window and seeing how it dries off. But we all know, everyone involved with local government knows that there's been chronic underfunding of local government since rate capping was introduced by Neville Wran in 1978. It's not well known, but it's a fact. I've read a New South Wales parliamentary research paper on it. On average, rates in New South Wales are the lowest in Australia. Why? Rate capping. Is that a good thing? Well, no, because what it's led to around New South Wales is poor amenity, declining hard assets, and a reduction in community services. I'm not here advocating for higher rates per se, but we have a stretched system in local government. Amalgamation has not made it one zot better. De-amalgamating will give, as others have said, the benefit of an elected body that represents us being much closer to the community, and that's much more pliable to the community's desires. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. We might go to some more questions and comments now, unless one of our speakers wants to jump in and add something to what Colin said. I'll take that as a no, and we'll move on. I have a hand up from Councillor Margarita de Cruz. Over to you.
Thanks, James, and I hope my screen doesn't freeze as well. Look, this has been my first term, and I see a few other Bushcare and Annandalites on the session, and I think that's what's been lost. And I think Jennifer alluded to that the precincts came under attack prior to the amalgamation, but the amalgamation itself has not actually. The process of putting in the administrator, I think, actually changed the culture of staff. My experience had been there was a much more responsiveness and an awareness of staff and involvement of the community with the council. That happened. It happened with communication with councillors as well. So it was that kind of, and it wasn't some of it was formal. I mean, having precincts, having the Heritage Committee, which John chaired, I think I can see the other half of the Heritage Committee here as well. Those kind of forums were really, really important to be able to turn up and to actually hear what was going on in other parts of the small Leichhardt Council, or relatively small Leichhardt Council. So we've lost all of those structures which actually enabled discussion. So, and that happened through amalgamation. There's been reference made, I think Jennifer, might have been Jennifer, but some mention of the local democracy groups, which of course says it all. Local democracy groups which are being selected by, handpicked by staff, are more akin to a mining company's reference group, and that's how I look at them. And so that's actually problematic, in that you have people who it's not quite clear what their role is, and maybe they're a focus group to get the wording right in a document, but they have no, it doesn't feed into the overall system. So very much, in my experience of being in the NNL precinct, we discussed issues, policies came up, they were discussed there, DAs came up, you discussed it there, those kind of things. And that was a community which, yeah, it was a grassroots community where you had something very local where you could go along and you could discuss it with a group. And then there were people who'd been at council and you would go to council occasionally on things. We even had presentations on the budget, and the transparency in the budget was much greater, because I remember going through and trying to find everything to do with Annandale and finding my projects who weren't there. We certainly don't have that degree of transparency now. I also see many of my bush caring colleagues from the community. I think what's happened with the Roselle Bay Community Nursery is just abominable. This was a nursery that was established by the community, and the community's just been excluded from it, and it is really unbelievable. I think what happened in the way the amalgamation was done has not been, I mean, some of it was destroyed on the way through, but in the amalgamation, the administrator was put in charge. And I guess what happened was that the creation of that fantastic thing, the council decides, there was no councillors, the administrator replaced the whole council. And I think that created a kind of an aspiration of certain people. And I think I attended one meeting where you saw the council and then you saw the advisory group sitting below them, and you kind of thought, well, what is the relationship here? Here's a whole lot of disempowered people appearing to be empowered or to give legitimacy to the administrator. I guess it says it all when one of the former general managers of Inner West Council, and there've been many, has now become the administrator of Central Coast, which of course has had major financial issues. Council is currently only in the black because of the acquisition of the Tempe lands from council for yet another road project by the state government. And even that, so the community has really been decimated by the amalgamation, and that connection is gone. And I think it's needed now more, it was needed more than ever because of such a large council, and it's completely been lost. So I think that those have been some real costs of the amalgamation and the way it was done. And maybe in fact that was the intention of the amalgamation in the first place.
Thank you, Margarita. Thanks for joining us tonight. Thanks for that contribution. I'll just throw in a question from the chat here, which I think is interesting. One of the councillors can maybe address this when I throw back to you. Why can't we reinstate precinct committees? They were great and abolished by Darcy. That's from Nathan in the chat. So we'll keep that one on notice. But I might take another speaker now. And let's see who we've got with hands up. Or I wonder if Councillor Macri wants to contribute. After all, he got the ball rolling on this. I believe he you put the initial motion forward. Do you want anything to contribute, Nick?
Yeah, sure. If you'd like me to speak, I will.
Please do.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'll acknowledge we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present. I think this has been a very difficult thing. Being a councillor since 2004, coming in, it was at the end of a time when Labor dominated the council, and it was almost like a wind of change in Marrickville. And I sat there in 2 terms of council and tried to learn and constructively work to make things better for the Marrickville residents. Then along came the amalgamation. At first, we resisted. Then we got legal advice. They said we didn't have a chance. I don't know if the mayors were privy to better advice than what we had. I'm not sure. So basically, we were all sacked and we were forcibly amalgamated. I don't think we really had that much say. I think there were greater minds or greater forces at play than the councillors that were in all the councils. In the Inner West Council, I have tried to be constructive. I've tried to work with councillors. Yes, we don't agree on things or how things should be done, and that's normal. I respect that, and I've always been respectful of other people's opinions. One of the clear problems is the meetings, because the meetings is where you actually sort these things out, and anyone who watches them knows how they are, and I'm not going to say anything more about them. If you really want to know, well, they're all on stream. Getting people involved in decision making is difficult when you have a lot of new councillors that don't really understand how things work. When you have ideology versus reality, that's a problem, because we want a perfect world. We all believe in a perfect world. How do we get there? That's been the clash in council. It got to the point where I could no longer take any more what was happening up there. And I was contacted by Grant Lee in the New South Wales Demerger Alliance. And I started working with them, and we started talking about how we actually get this going and what we do. And I had moved a motion to write to our local government members, our state members, to actually take the fight for us for de-amalgamation. Due to this functionality of the meetings, there was a number of cycles passed. It didn't get there, the motion. In the meantime, one Saturday night I was sitting home and I got an email from Grant Lee from the New South, and he sent me the legislation. I looked at it, I read it, I couldn't believe it. I thought, this is amazing. We now have a pathway to go. It's no longer there's no road. There is a road if we choose to take it. If the community chooses to take this road, there is a road. I was shocked. I rang up John Stamolis straight away and I said, John, I've got this legislation. I read it to him. He goes, Vic, someone's having a lend of you. They're playing a prank on you. They're trying to set you up to look like a deal. I said, John, I've Googled it 3 times. I found this legislation. Together, we sat together and we called for the extraordinary meeting. We put it in. And with the help of Pip Hinman, who actually assisted, we decided we were going to include the poll question as a central part to this thing, because don't worry about the Morrison Lowe report. It's about the community. It's what the community wants. If the community wants this, then they should have it. So I look at the Morrison Lowe report, and John was very correct in what he said. There's a very, 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 very large disclaimer at the beginning of it saying basically everything you read here is rubbery estimates based on assumptions. The very thing we brought up at the meetings about shared services and the ability to actually get a better outcome for the community with shared services and returning local democracy by going from 15 councillors to 36 councillors. It's really just mentioned in there that could be a benefit, but it's a bit light on. The reference to the staff, it said 71% of staff were okay. There's probably 2/3 of the staff from former councils. There's probably a third that I knew that wouldn't know. And what happens there is, it is a bit of a concern when virtually 1 in 3 people that work there don't think it's a good thing. That's what the numbers are. So I think that's telling in that. And when you look at the longevity of the amalgamation, I've harped on this. Tough decisions need to be made, because 1 and 1 equals 2. If you spend 3, we have a problem. We have to find the solution. Otherwise, we lose 2 as well as everything. That's where the clear issue is here. We have to let the people first have the poll, have their say. And at the last demerger meeting on Sunday, I made the point very clear. The poll is not, it's not compulsory. It is actually voluntary. So it's our job in the community to let people know that they should engage and do the poll question. We can't say how they are. I mean, as a Marrickville councillor, former Marrickville councillor, I know Marrickville had balanced budgets all the way through. When I look at these projections for Marrickville, $16 million deficits into the future, I can't fathom that, and I can't understand it, because we haven't had any new services delivered. There is nothing more. If anything, there's a degradation of services, so there's less. And the clear example for me comes in numbers, and I always refer to facts rather than hearsay or naysay. The current street cleaning budget for the Inner West Council is $9 million. Now, in 2012, when I was mayor, we undertook an extensive review of that service. We were spending $4.5 million in 2012. What would $4.5 million look in 2012 in 2021? Now, if you said it was 5 million, does that mean we're spending 2.5 million to do Leichhardt and 2.5 million to do Ashfield? I don't think so. There's something wrong in the economies of scale haven't delivered, and it's clearly shown in the way that the wages or the employee costs have increased over 7.7 million. We've got less people employed, but we're paying more money for that. How does that work, and how does that deliver a better outcome to the community? The community-centric focus is lost. And as a councillor, I'm telling you, I have to spend a lot of time when I have to go out of the area and understand different things where, yeah, I'm not that familiar with. It takes more time, and people are patient and they take you through it. But I physically have to go out there to understand it. Otherwise, I don't understand it. And because you're not there, I started doing the Bay Run to understand the challenges around the Bay Run. You know, you have to get out there and experience it. But if you talk to me about Marrickville or Tempe or St. Peters or Sydenham, Dulwich Hill, I can talk you right through that off the top of my head because I've lived it and experienced it. The biggest challenge in a de-amalgamation, if it was to go ahead, I don't think it's going to be the numbers. It's going to be making sure that we can deliver A, a poll result, B, that we don't let the government put an administrator in power to do whatever they need to do. We need to actually have councillors do the actual job that the administrator would do at a fraction of the cost, mind you, and more connected to the community than an administrator is. I'm confident Marrickville could pack up and do a Brit exit and be fine. My concern would be for Ashfield and Leichhardt. They're the ones that I would worry about. I'd have no concerns about Marrickville going it on its own. I mean, there was talk of the money we got from the lands from Tempe. There's $80 million there just in that area. When you look at that, plus we have about $30 million in our Section 94 reserve funds. Ashfield's got about $2 million in their Section 94. Leichhardt has got probably about $1.5 million, I think, because prior to the forced amalgamation, Leichhardt went in and actually spent all their money. They committed all their funds to a whole lot of projects, a lot of them which haven't even been realised as yet. So I'm very confident that Marrickville could stand on their own. And I hope Marrickville people do take this opportunity to have their say. Morrison Low, they can say what they want. The long-term financial plan for Inner West Council is much bleaker than what I think our future of a single entity of Marrickville is. It's getting the right people in there. It's understanding that whatever we do, we have to do for the good of the community and make a better community, but an engaged community, which is what we have. I mean, I still remember chairing the development meetings, and people would come up and they would argue and put their case forward. We'd say, well, look, let's go out and have an inspection. We'd go out, we'd engage the community, and we'll explain to them. And there were situations where, there was a situation where the fellow's entitled to build another level in his house. It's going to take some of your sunlight away. We'd get involved and we'd say to the people, are you prepared to put in some skylights for these people to compensate them for your impact to their solar access? Yeah, okay, we'll do that. We make good relationships between neighbours because we drill down to the micro levels. It's not happening in the big council. The big council wants to glaze over everything and just paper over all the cracks, and that's it.
Yeah.
That's
Vic,
to the...
Can I wind you up, Vic? Because we've got a lot of people wanting to speak.
No.
Thank you very much for that. I look forward to seeing you on the Bay Run sometime. Now, we had some comments in the chat from former Leichhardt Mayor Marie Sheehan, but I believe she now has a hand up to speak. So if you want to unmute and turn your camera on, Marie.
I've unmuted, but I'm not turning my camera on because the NBN is a bit dodgy at the moment.
Okay, that's good. It sounds nice and clear, so go ahead.
Okay, so look, I think the critical issue here is getting information, education, if you like, out there into the community about the benefits, particularly in terms of democracy and local decision making, about de-amalgamation. That's the critical thing. And I also think that if it's run by just political parties, if you like, campaigning, it could well then just people go, oh, for goodness sake, it's just another election campaign. So I think it has to be independent. I mean, in terms of working on it, I'd be quite happy to work with any of the political groupings that currently exist on council to do that. But I think that's a critical point. And there's a whole process which I'm aware of about how you do that campaigning in an election period. Now, in terms of the various issues that have come up during the conversation, and potentially people's perception of councils, and also the state government's agenda. So consistently at the moment, and I do quite a lot of traveling around meeting different councils in the metro area and in regional New South Wales as well, is the label that's now being put on councils. They're called boards of directors. And that's a significant shift away from democracy. And I think that's an issue to be dealt with. The other one on the selling of assets, and that's also a state-imposed agenda. It's to do with the treasury rules that currently exist and the rules about how you manage assets and get returns on investment. And that's a thing the community just has no understanding of. They don't understand it. Corporatization, which has occurred significantly in Inner West Council. I mean, as a regular resident, if you like, I could ring up if there was something happening and talk to the person who was dealing with it directly. Now you have to ring up, you get an SMS, you get a note, you get a number, it's corporatized. So you no longer have a connection with the council staff, and people are understanding that. In terms of the de-amalgamation process, one of the challenges is the assumptions and methodologies that are used in calculating the costs. And as a number of people have mentioned, the costs are only calculated on the financial, and that can scare people because they think it might mean, oh my God, my rates are going to rise. So that's another significant part of the education process, I think, in terms of pulling people together. A good example that came up, I think it was Margarita brought it up, is the exclusion of the community from the Roselle Bay Nursery, which is down the road from me here. And I, talked with and had conversations with a number of the people who worked in both at the nursery and also in a number of parklands around the area, because they were completely locked out. I mean, they had previously engaged, they used to do work all the time. One of them had a key down to one of the local areas, and he used to look after the worm farm and so on. And then a corporatization process came into it. So, no, the rule is no member of the community can have a key. You've got to do this. You've got to sign a disclaimer. You've got to sign up to this. And so they lock people out. And that was the end of that community participation process. And it was all justified on the basis of insurance and risk assessment and new rules and corporatizations. And I think that has to be stopped, and it can be stopped by having a smaller council, but also by resisting the corporatization. And I think that sort of education process, if you like, and engaging with the community about how life could be better. I mean, there's a councillors forum that was due to come up, and it's down at Addison Road. And I was contacted by one of the organisers to get a screening of Rats in the Ranks. And I thought, okay, Rats in the Ranks. So I rang Larry and I rang Bob, and yeah, everything's fine. And then I said, I'd better look at it again because I haven't seen it in many years. So I looked at it and I thought, it was fascinating. The engagement between the community and the councillors was absolutely direct and clear and engaging. There weren't any systems and processes in place. I mean, yes, it was a formal council meeting, but the engagement was genuine and real and understood. And I think that's what we've lost, and that's what we need to recapture. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Okay,
Moira, sorry. Moira.
Hello?
It's Moira.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry.
God. Well, how,
I know. It happens all the time.
Does it?
Yeah.
He obviously doesn't know.
I'm only mildly embarrassed.
You gotta laugh.
Let's move on.
Okay.
So I'm going to throw it back to one of our speakers now, whoever wants to step up. I mean, I think Moira was talking about how we communicate the benefits of de-amalgamation, and that mirrors a question that we had in the chat from Rachel. How can we win the polls to de-amalgamate? If somebody wants to speak to that. And also if somebody could address the issue of the precinct committees that we had a question about earlier. Perhaps Pip, or maybe one of the current councillors.
James, it's John.
Yeah.
Look, in regard to the precinct committees, a number of people will know that I was in the resident precinct in Balmain White Bay for 10 years before becoming elected to council. And I spent 9 of those 10 years chairing the Balmain White Bay precinct committee. And I see some other faces around here. Jennifer was also on the Leichhardt precinct. We had a lot to do with each other. But one of the reasons that I see the removal of these groups, the removal of volunteers, the control over our local democracy committee is fear. It's a council that doesn't want input. It's afraid of input. It's afraid to hear from our community. That has been the essence of Inner West Council. It was not the essence of Leichhardt. It's very much fear-based. Whenever organisations don't want to hear from their customers or their stakeholders or groups, there's problems. There's problems, and when it takes deliberate efforts to cut that out, that you're in a control structure, and that other voices are not invited. So that's my comment there. But I'd also like to make one other further comment while I have access to the microphone. and that is that I'm not sure whether Councillor Lockie, Pauline and Councillor Macri would agree with me as fellow independents, but as the merger increases our population, we will reach a point where it is very, very difficult to get broader representation onto council. That is, your independents will go. With a ward size of 42,000, and I'm a pretty damn good statistician, I reckon I'm about 4,000 or 5,000 people out. And even with a long history and a long reputation, I think I'm about 4,000 or 5,000 people away from not being able to compete. Now, I can guarantee you what in Balmain Ward, Labor and Liberal will now start approving a lot of developments to achieve that. But I feel that once Pauline and Dick and I move on in the years ahead, whenever that might be, the ability for any new independents to come forward, unless they're media personalities or stars or something else, will be nil. They will have nil opportunity as the population rises on our council. We compete against three very, very strong political party machines in the Inner West. Very, very strong. Two in particular, very strong. And as Sandra Huckabee pointed out earlier, and which I comment on a lot, 90% of our councils in Australia operate without the political parties, 90% of them. They do great jobs with innovative programs, fantastic services, great social initiatives. They can do that. 90% of our councils in Australia, I don't know why, a core set of councils in Sydney needs to be dominated by party politics. And in fact, you'll see those councils that are on the merger list and the very big councils of Sydney, those with over 240,000 are strongly Labor and Liberal councils. And maybe the Minister needs to do something about that. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I'll just get Pip maybe to comment on that other point. How do we communicate the benefits of de-amalgamation? How do we win? How do we win a poll on de-amalgamation?
Oh, thanks, James. Look, I think Maura made a lot of very good points just then. And I appreciate the fact that she even seemed to volunteer to help campaign for on the question of the benefits of de-amalgamation, because that's what worries me at the moment, which is the question that you know, we got this poll. Of course, it's a non-binding poll. It's an indicative poll. It's really just there as a political pressure point. But how do we now maximise the next 3 months until the election to engage people in the discussion about the benefits of de-amalgamation? So how do we broaden out this discussion, and importantly, how do we bring younger people into it? Because, you know, they're going to pay higher when rates go up and services go down. You know, they're still going to be paying their high rents in this area. But I think we've got a lot of pluses going for us. Younger people just moved in the area may not have the same views as some of us that have been living here for longer, but I think they will engage on the politics of the matter. This is a diverse, progressive area. I think that's of benefit to this campaign. I think younger people understand, who are, you know, a lot of them with degrees can't find work, doing casual work, and then like the Annette Kellerman pool workers just got the sack because the lockdown happened, no pandemic leave. They can join the dots. Yes, it's good that council will take back the operation of that pool, but, you know, they can see pretty clearly that perhaps if council were running these pools, you know, they may not have been stood down at the beginning of lockdown, and they can see the corporatisation process is affecting them as well. How do we involve these younger people in this discussion? I think, you know, the next steps are going to be very important for a campaign to involve people in this discussion. And it starts with, I think, council signing off on yes and no cases. At the moment, we have this Morrison Lowe report up on the website. I don't know who's going to go and read it necessarily, 65 pages of it. Some people will. I've read it, but what we need is accessible information for people to start to entertain the ideas. Oh yeah, look, actually, this could be run in a different way. One thing that the Morrison Law Report does do, apart from obfuscating and saying it can't get data and it can't do this and it can't do that, it actually does state emphatically that a benefit from de-amalgamation would be greater representation. Now, most people can understand that as democracy. I think that's a very easy argument to make. Interestingly, at the moment, the Labor Party is scoffing at that notion, greater representation. And they scoff and say, oh, you just want to be on council because, you know, you want it as a political platform. But they can't actually understand the concept of councillors working with residents groups to get things done, as has happened before, and it's really not a big stretch of the imagination. So I think next steps are for the council to sign off on the yes and no cases. Yes, of course, they're going to be diametrically opposed, but we need it in a language that's going to engage people. That has to be distributed to everybody in their letterbox. And then, you know, and the sleight of hand that's happening at the moment on council, which is, you know, the big case, the financial case from the reputable law firm is there saying basically it's all going to be too costly. You wouldn't want to go down that track. I think, you know, that has to be counterbalanced. Now we have the time, as I said. Can you unscramble an egg is often, you know, what people throw at those of us that are saying, you know, think about it, it's not that hard. I think, you know, I don't know that the metaphor is that useful, to tell you the truth. Even the report from Morrison Lowe indicates that the three former councils are basically the entities are still basically there. And they admit that in one section of the report, you could operate an IT system in the cloud, which would make it, you know, a lot less expensive. Unfortunately, they don't go down the track of actually investigating how you could make how this would actually work. They didn't actually get in touch with any. There's a lot of work that has been done on de-amalgamation and de-amalgamated councils. But I think the community has enough diversity, has enough progressive ideas to imagine how it could work better than what it's doing now. I guess just my final point about this question of politics. Look, you know, I guess I don't quite subscribe to, you know, big party politics, small party politics. It's all political, really. You know, I come from a tiny little party, for instance. But I have common cause with all the councillors that are saying we want more democracy, we need more democracy, that's how we get things done. That's the only way we get things done, because we're up against this huge state government that wants to push its agenda. It's all political, whether you say you're in a political party or not a political party, you're going to have a political view. I think what this process to even get the poll question agreed to has shown is that people from diverse backgrounds, political backgrounds, can work together on something that's going to give residents, they can see that will give residents a greater say in their local government area. Okay, we're not going to agree on everything, and that's not the issue, but I think people that are, you know, I think we can engage. I think there's enough indication just in the short time that the poll question has even been on the agenda for us to engage people across the three council areas, and I think that's what we need to do in the next period. Thanks.
Thanks, Pip. We're getting near towards the end. We have if you want to stay in touch with this de-amalgamation campaign, we have a stay in touch form. I'm going to ask super producer Duncan to put that in the chat if he can. So there's just there's a few more comments in the chat agreeing with the points Rochelle made about the cultural aspects of an amalgamated council. And here's one from Justine Langford, which is the ethos of an amalgamated council doesn't match the values of the local community. It's not local enough. It's run like a business. Community becomes just a number, very impersonal, loss of services, loss of integrity. I have another hand up from Hall. So
James.
I'll throw to you now, Hall.
Thanks, James. I mean, I think a number of people have alluded to this, and I think it's something that we should put our minds to, and that's organising the campaign from here on. Before the COVID crisis hit us, Rochelle Porteous had actually called people together, residents in Balmain and the old Leichhardt municipality, to actually begin a campaign to bring back Leichhardt Council. Now, it seems to me that if the councillors who are here tonight were to combine in their various areas and, have some kind of, to use the old-fashioned term, united front campaign on, as well as putting it in their own material in favour of a yes vote for de-amalgamation and bringing our councils back, but trying to get a wider committee, which don't only include in themselves, but people from other parties and people from no parties at all. I think that would be well worth doing. And I see Rochelle and John are here from my side of Parramatta Road, and Margarita, of course. So, I mean, I think the makings are there, and I would encourage the existing councillors who have been pushing this de-amalgamation and bringing back our councils to see if they can actually convene a meeting with residents that come along, and perhaps a committee could be elected at those meetings who would not be members of any political party, or certainly not candidates, who would then take over the campaign, raise some money, get a leaflet out, set up a website, Facebook pages and so on, and get things rolling. But it just seems to me that we just need people to take initiatives in the various council areas. Would be logical to start the campaign on a broad basis as possible. So I just throw that in, because I think we shouldn't go away from this meeting without taking some steps towards, getting an organised campaign underway.
Thanks, Hall. That contact form is in the chat now, if anyone wants to jump on and fill that out, stay in touch with this campaign. We're getting near the end. I have a hand up from Brian Halstead. So, Brian, if you'd like to speak.
Just a quick word. I think the focus should not be too much on the one-off costs of de-amalgamation. In theory, the government will pay for them under the new legislation. The crucial thing is, how do you run a council where the councillors and the representatives know what's happening, know the area, know the people, and therefore can set the services, set the rates, and get the council back to a positive financial position. And that can only happen with a smaller council. And that's the key. And I think to pick up the points that Rochelle made is that you want that sense of community, that sense of belonging, and then people will understand the way the accounts work, and you'll have councillors who know the areas, who know where the costs lie, and there won't be the ability of the corporate functions to hide in a huge mass of costs things. So it has to get smaller, where the representatives can actually know what's happening.
Thank you, Brian. I just want to ask any of the councillors we haven't heard from want to speak. Pauline Lockie, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, thank you, James, and thanks everybody for sticking with it for 2 hours now. I think it's great to see so many people here and so engaged in this. And I think, what we've heard very clearly tonight is how much people have missed having that very direct community engagement and these forums in which to connect directly with each other and also with other councillors as well. I'm really pleased that we are able to have this poll with the election coming up. I took the position coming into council that I always thought that people should be able to have a say on whether they wanted to keep this council or go back to the former councils. So I really pleased that we're going ahead and doing that now. It's always struck me as interesting that the footprint of Inner West Council looks an awful lot like the footprint of Greenland when you look at it, and I think that points a lot to who benefits from a merged council staying exactly the way, from the merger happening in the first place, and who benefits from it, the status quo staying the way it is. Look, and to go back to the comment on precinct committees as well, John, I don't know if you'll remember, but the very first motion that I put to council after being elected was to reinstate precinct committees, not just in the former Leichhardt LGA, but to bring that across the entire LGA as well. Unfortunately, that went down by one vote, but it was something that I felt quite strongly about then, and still feel quite strongly about now, is that particularly with a bigger council, it's really important to have those voices of the community coming in to representatives. It's important with a smaller council as well, but really critical with a larger council. And I think we've all felt disjointed at many times with the decisions we've had to make, and not if it's not in our particular ward or in our very local area, with being very conscious that we're not necessarily hearing all the voices we need to hear as a result of that. I should go to as well, in terms of the committees that we've got now, I think there was a comment made before that they're mainly professional people. Look, to some extent they are, but I think it's also fair to say they're volunteers, and there are a lot of residents who've stepped up to be on those committees, including, I've recognised a number of names of people who have been on our various committees at Inner West Council, who have put in a lot of time and commitment and effort to try and drive the direction of our council in the areas that they're particularly passionate about. But I think it was John who alluded before to the fact that there's no direct connection between those committees and the council boards. There's no direct channel and direct power through from those committees to council, which has been a real issue on this elected term. In terms of, I very much hear the concerns. I think Jennifer articulated it most clearly, that feeling of not being sure which way is going to be the right way forward, and it's not particularly helped when the key piece of official information we've got from our council points only towards the financial costs of that merger. I think no matter what, many of you know I am running again for the next council. I think it's really critical, no matter what happens with the poll, and the reason I wanted a poll was to be able to hear from the community, what do you want, and then go forward from there. Is whether we stay merged or whether we split up. I think what's really going to be critical is reinstating that voice of the community back to the elected council and making sure people are heard. I think that's been the biggest, I'm a first-time councillor, I think that's been the biggest issue we've had on this one, is there's been a real determination to shut out the community in various ways, and we've seen that creep in. That's certainly something I want to see come back in, whatever happens with the next term. And look, I don't want to cut off anyone else who wants to speak now. I think the only other thing I'd comment on the Morrison Lowe report, because I think it's been articulated quite well how that is only one point of view, is that you'll notice in that report the pathway forward, even though they recognise that there's no set methodology for demerging councils, the pathway that they've suggested we go forward with is that we will immediately demerge in 6 months' time, and that process will be entirely handled by an unelected administrator, and that will take about 18 months to do. I personally don't think that is the way forward, and certainly if there's no methodology, I don't see why that would be the only way forward. I think that's absolutely a process that can and should be guided by the elected body that remains on council, and it will be, especially because it will be a process that, even if, let's say, the vote is overwhelmingly in favour of demerging, that's still a process that's going to take time. There are still services that need to be run in the meantime, particularly given that we will be coming out of the COVID crisis for years to come yet. We want to make sure that if we're going to demerge, that we do that right and in a way that doesn't leave the community facing a sudden cutoff and sudden changes like we had coming into this forced merger. So that's certainly one pathway that one flaw that I really noticed in that report, and that I would say that that's a really big push that we'd have to do. That's going to be part of the scare campaign, I think, in terms of why you wouldn't want to demerge, that it would mean a death of democracy and so forth. I would really stress as part of any campaign for that that is not the only pathway forward. But look, I should stop. I'm very tired. We had a very late council meeting last night. But look, thank you again for pulling this together. Thank you again for coming. Thank you for caring about the community. And please, at any time, if there's anything, anytime you want to chat, or I'm on all the social media channels and email as well. So please get in touch. I'll drop contact details into the chat for you all.
Thanks, Pauline. That was excellent. And a few people in the chat have also realised the synergy between the size and shape of the Greenland electorate and the Inner West Council footprint. So I think you're onto something there. I'll just wrap it up with a couple of quick hot takes. Nathan says, throw Darcy's classic line back at him. If you want to change the status quo, you've got to change the government, i.e. you've got to change the mayor. Interesting. And finally, from Jim and Coral, local participatory democracy should be our central slogan. And on that positive note, I think we will have to wrap it up now, folks. Thank you to our key speakers. Thank you to everyone who commented and put the time in to join us